Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to Unlearn with Bianca. If you are tuning in for the first time, then welcome. On this podcast, we explore everything around self-healing, health, personal growth, the mind-body connection, relationships, and more. In these episodes, I'm here to empower you, to educate you, and to challenge you so that you can deepen the connection that you have with yourself. Hello, guys. Welcome back. In today's episode, we are going to be looking at the signs of growth. How you know when you have changed internally or you have grown. The thing about self-growth and change is it's often when we're in the midst of it, when we're in the process, it's actually quite difficult to recognize what's changed and how much we've evolved until we actually take a moment to reflect, to look at the past, and really celebrate ourselves for what is different, where we have changed. So this is why I wanted to do today's episode, because I don't think we take enough time to do this. So I'm going to go through 7 ways that you know you've grown, or 7 signs of growth. And as you listen, if you're resonating, if you're connecting to what I'm saying, I want you to recognize that in yourself and really celebrate that. Really think about how far you've come. Start to take that time to actually recognize, I have evolved in this area, and celebrate yourself for doing so. So let's jump straight into it. So number 1, you know you have grown when you start questioning and unlearning society's definition of success. This is a major one because for the most part, we are not naturally taught to trust ourselves, to trust our intuition. What we are trained to do, and especially as humans, as a species, we want to fit in, we want to be liked. We are trained to seek approval externally from other people and to gain validation externally. We're not conditioned to really ask ourselves what is important to us at the individual level. It is never too late to ask these questions, though, and if you've started to ask these questions to yourself, then that is a sign of growth. So society often measures success through external markers, and that can be things like, job titles, could be the amount of money you have in the bank, or how much property you own, your social status, relationships, whether you're in a relationship, how perfect it appears from the outside. But as we get older and as we start to evolve and start to grow internally, what can happen is you get to what you thought would make you happy and it actually doesn't make you any happier. That's when you start to really ask yourself what is important to you, what your values are. And you start to ask the hard questions because you realize that one size does not fit all. And I really think as a society, we went through this collective, fast-paced period of people doing this around the time of COVID, when we were forced to be, in our own company, forced to be not turning to all the things that we'd usually do to give us that sense of validation or excitement. And a lot of people were going through this process at the moment, starting to question, is this really serving me? Is what I'm doing, how I'm being, who I'm in relationships with, is this actually working for me? Or am I doing this out of expectation? Am I doing this out of habit? So I'll share some examples, some like real life examples of what I mean by questioning and unlearning society's version of success. So the first one is in career and work. Examples in career or in work would be if you got a new role, if you got a promotion, but you just weren't feeling content or any different about that. You might start questioning whether climbing, let's say, the corporate ladder is truly fulfilling to your value system, or if you're just doing it because it's what you thought you should do. I remember saying on one of my first podcasts, I had this moment when I was about 23 and I just finished my master's. I still have a student loan, but I had put all my money into like my business master's degree and my psychology, and I got into this business development corporate role. And it was just so uncomfortable sitting at that job knowing I'm not enjoying this. Like there were elements I did enjoy, but I was like, I know there has to be more. There has to be more. But because I had focused on what I'd done to get to that point, all the study I'd put in, I thought there'd be a clear path of me feeling good in a certain role. And it wasn't like that. It became really uncomfortable. And I had to start asking myself, have I been thinking I should do this from an external perspective? Or is this truly what lights me up? And obviously, I do something completely different now. So I made a new choice, which wasn't easy. But that's an example. So you start to realize that success, internal success, does not necessarily have to mean a high paying job. For some people, it may mean having more flexibility, having more creativity or space to be creative, or work that actually aligns for your values. For other people, that might not be true. It doesn't actually matter what suits one or the other. It's actually starting to question, is this aligned with me as a person? Something that I think is really uncomfortable that a lot of people have told me that they've come to this realization with is that hard work does not always mean job security. And that's what we're sort of taught to believe, that if we work hard, if we are loyal to a company, that we're going to have a secure job. And times are changing. And we know that it's not necessarily how things go at the moment. So all of these things, all of these ways that we've been operating as society, all these beliefs we have, when we can start to challenge them and start to question them, it can be really beneficial. There's also expectations from a societal level about how relationships should look. And I definitely think this is changing. But typically, if we don't stop to actually ask the hard questions, most people feel this pressure to follow a timeline and tick the boxes, right? It's like marriage, kids, buying a house, just because it is expected. And as I said, like a lot of people are realizing, well, this actually doesn't necessarily lead to more fulfillment. Each to their own, like different people want different things. But at a societal level, there are certain expectations and pressures that we can start to question. Is this actually bringing me happiness? Or is this just because I've been told that this will bring me happiness? A way that I really realized I had grown, especially when it comes to relationships, is realizing that some relationships in my life were existing because of convenience and not necessarily because of connection. And that can apply to friendships, family relationships, romantic relationships. But when you have that realization of, oh, this is just being like a habitual relationship rather than like a genuine connection, that is a sign of growth. You might also realize that love or connecting with someone at their romantic level, it's not necessarily about proving your worth or trying to fix someone or change someone to fit into your box. It's about mutual growth and respect. And a huge, huge sign of growth is when you stop chasing, stop proving, stop bending, and to fit in spaces that you have outgrown. Honestly, when it comes to relationships all round, I think that is a huge one. It's about mutual respect. It's about really being confident in who you are. And from that place, you will attract the right friendships and relationships into your life. If I look back, especially in the last 10 years, another way that I really know I have evolved and grown, and I know some of you will relate to this, is realizing that I've really started to unlearn society's expectations around beauty standards and just challenge this narrative around body image and how we should be presenting consistently. If we're not careful and we are constantly consuming media and, trying to live up to this perfect image, it is really difficult to do that from a place of compassion because there is so much pressure to keep up with these beauty standards. When you stop believing that being thin, being toned, being fit, fitting a certain body type makes you worthy, makes you a better person, makes you successful, you are unlearning society's definition of quote unquote success. When you start focusing on how you feel in your body rather than how it looks to others, that is true freedom. Now, I've done a whole episode on this if you guys want to hear my own take on this, but I spent so many years picking apart my body, wanting to enhance my body, which I'm really glad I didn't, to be honest. But so many different things, so many phases I went through with my body that just led me to a lot of disconnection. So really starting to challenge, where have I learnt this? Where have I learnt to treat my body like this? Where have I learnt to pick myself apart? That is the key to liberation in this area. And one more example I want to give that I feel really strongly about is challenging this narrative. You know, you've grown when you're challenging this narrative that intelligence equals degrees, formal education. I really disagree with that to my core. If you have been realizing that intelligence is more about emotional intelligence, creativity, lived experience, this is a sign of growth and evolution. Knowing that just because someone is book smart does not make them the most intelligent person. And I think so many of us have wounding, a lot of people have wounding from when we're younger, thinking we're not smart enough, and realizing that that was just people being put in one box. One way of defining intelligence through an education system, which is definitely changing. If you're connecting to what I'm saying, then these are signs of growth when you're starting to question things, but also knowing that this process can actually feel really isolating. It can feel really confusing because it's not just about shifting your actions or your goals. When you're going through this process internally, it's about challenging the framework that has shaped your entire life, you know, your belief systems. There will be times where you feel torn, and this happens to me, between what you've been told and conditioned that success is against what success feels like it is to you. And that's the fear of, you know, fears come up like people judging you for making certain choices, questioning, is this really me? Is this important to me? And that is just your authentic self versus your conditioned self. So as we start to step more and more into like what's really important to us, we build that confidence to start making choices that really align with our authentic self. But this can take some time and it can be a bit back and forth, and it's all very normal and very part of the process. If I come against this sort of internal conflict of like, oh, I think I want to do this, but everyone else is doing something completely different, and it feels lonely, and I'm like, oh, am I making the right choice? I really take a moment and I tune into my body. And what I do is I kind of imagine I'm stepping into, let's say, that other person that's living the other life. I try and step into their shoes, and I sort of teleport myself into their lives. And I think, if I was really making that choice, that one that everyone seems to be doing, would I truly be happy? How does that feel in my body? Does it feel constricted? Does it feel tight? Or does it feel expansive? And 9 times out of 10, when I actually take time to do that, I realize, oh, yep, that's okay. When I realize that I'm stepping into their shoes, I feel constricted. I don't feel comfortable. Therefore, I know that the other choice, the one that perhaps is a bit more daunting, a bit more scary, a bit more different, is the right decision for me. And it's continuing to do that whenever this discomfort comes up. I really like to remind myself that I'm on my own path. And I know we all know this to be true. You guys are on your own path, your unique path. The more that you can focus on what you're doing and block out the noise, the easier life gets. So I just want to finish this point with some reflection questions. If you want to, you know, spend a bit more time on this point around questioning and defining your own version of success, then write down these questions. So, number one, what messages about success did I grow up with? And then the second one is, whose approval was I seeking when I pursued certain goals? It can be an interesting one to reflect on. The third one is, if no one else was watching, what would I want to create and achieve? And the last one is, how do I want to feel in my life? Rather than just what I want to accomplish, I want you to answer, how do I want to feel in my life? Because that really helps us connect into what values are important. One more thing I do consistently is I just have in the back of my mind, am I making this choice because I want to do this or because others expect this of me? And it's just a nice one to ask yourself when you come against that discomfort. Number 2, you know you have grown when you are more selective of the energy you engage in. Everything carries energy. Food, people, environment, media. You have grown, you have evolved when you become more aware of especially who you surround yourself with and what you're consuming energetically. So, yes, you become more aware of what goes into your body, what you are listening to, what you're watching. But the real sign of growth, I think, is when you are more aware of what conversations you choose to feed and engage in. So, you just don't have the energy to be judging. You don't have the energy to be gossiping. You just do not have the energy to be going into that small talk, to be complaining. And this is a sign that you have evolved and you are more conscious of where your energy goes. So I talk to my clients about this often because what can happen, let's say you've been dealing with anxiety or chronic fatigue, and you meet somebody else who's also going through the same thing, naturally you start to have this bond with them. And every time you catch up, you're like talking about symptoms. You might be talking about, struggles. You start to bond over that experience. Let's just say then that one person actually starts to make improvements. One person starts to realize, oh, actually change is possible and I don't want to live like that anymore. It can be really confronting and threatening to the other person that is still stuck. What once fueled us in a conversation or a certain behavior that someone was presenting, it no longer fuels us when we are growing and evolving. I think this can cause a lot of frustration for so many of us because we feel really disconnected from people we once felt really connected to. But if you can have that level of compassion and just know that everyone's pace is different and not have to force anyone to believe anything in particular, then I think that's the best way to go about it. But knowing that as we grow, as we change, a really healthy response, a really normal response is just being more mindful of how we are engaging in conversations and who we are engaging with. I definitely knew I had evolved in this area when I started realizing that I was prioritizing my peace over being right and trying to get a point across. As you start to shift internally, you stop feeling this need to always be right to prove a point because you realize that your piece is actually more important than winning every single argument and debate because it goes back to your energy, right? Trying to do that, trying to persuade people, trying to convince people, trying to get people to see your point of view, it can be an energy drain. So you start actually realizing where my energy goes, is it actually worth it? And this desire to win, it's not as enticing. It's just not as enticing as it used to be. For me personally, like I used to love a debate. I used to be so strong in my opinions. But now I feel like I just don't have the same level of, what's the word I'm looking for? I just feel like I don't need to prove my point as much. So if you're resonating, that is a sign of growth. The really hard thing as you start to be more mindful of what and who you're spending your energy on and those conversations you're engaging with, as you recognize that not everybody's heading in the same direction as you. And that's not right nor wrong. It's just that sometimes people who you once thought would be a part of your life that were heading in the same direction and you're just naturally heading in different directions. And that's a really difficult thing to go through sometimes. But if you're anything like me, like I crave authentic relationships, and surface level relationships just don't really do it for me anymore. I mean, I think we can all engage in like surface level conversations and that kind of thing. But the more you stay true to yourself and you stop trying to cling on so much to people and things that have just naturally heading in a different direction, you actually start to create space for new, more aligned relationships, friendships, things to come into your life. And this is the important bit I'm getting at here is when you recognize, hey, I can let this go gently without trying to grip on and trying to make it mean anything, create all these stories. That's a really huge sign of growth, knowing that you trust that new things will eventually make them their way to you and that this is just a phase that you're moving through. It's not going to be like this forever. The next one, number 3, you know you are growing or have grown when you are becoming more proactive and less reactive. This one is another really important one, understanding that you are the creator of your life. Life is happening for you, not to you. So your responses and your reactions to life's experiences are the one thing that you have influence over. And this one can be so confronting. I was actually speaking at an event in the weekend and saying to the crowd that it took me years before I realized, oh, I might have a part to play or have some form of influence over being able to influence and impact chronic symptoms. I was so resistant to that for so long, and unconsciously it felt safer to think that this was something happening to me outside of me that I had no control over because it didn't require any responsibility from me. But it got to a point where I was like, okay, well, I have to change something because something's not working, you know? So just having this internal locus of control, realizing that when you have started to become more influential over your responses and your reactions, naturally you are going to become less reactive. And that is a sign that you are growing. When you start to be open to the fact that triggers that come up in people or in places, things can actually be an invitation to start to reflect and start to grow, that is massive. I remember the first time I had that like aha moment, and it was huge. So an example of that, let's say before you have that realization, maybe like a friend or a partner says something that really hurts you, and without thinking, you shut down, or you might lash out and get aggressive, or you just withdraw. You just have this instant reaction. For me in the past, like emotions would take over and I would be upset. I'd be ruminating for hours, feeling misunderstood. I'd avoid addressing something that come up, and I'd think if I address this, I'll feel weak. There was like a whole lot of things, and you know, I'm sure some of you are relating, a whole lot of things that can come up. But in this state, your reactions are controlling you or controlling me. And it keeps us in this cycle of emotional reactivity. So when you start to realize, oh, this trigger doesn't necessarily mean it's about me, it's an invitation to actually stop, look at my choices, reflect, you start to become, over time, more proactive. So let's say I've been doing this for a while. If I'm faced with the same situation, or you're faced with the same situation, what you would naturally start to do, because our brain learns through habit, if someone had said something that really hurt you, you'd pause, you'd take a breath, you would notice the emotion that's coming up, and instead of reacting out of fight or flight, you would reflect. You'd ask yourself this question, probably internally: why does this hurt me? What is it about this that's really hurt me? And when you recognize that it's a deep trigger, you can actually respond to that other person with more clarity in your own time. So when you said that, I felt hurt because it reminded me of X. You know, you can start to actually vocalize and communicate calmly and set boundaries if you're needed. You create space for a more productive conversation. And it doesn't mean that there's no discomfort. I'm sure there's still discomfort. There's discomfort when I have a lot of conversations, but you now have influence over your response. So you're more proactive rather than reactive. It's the same with when we receive feedback. Let's say you were in a meeting and your boss, someone in your team gave you feedback. If you were in a reactive state, you might just snap back or get into that passive aggressiveness. You'd feel hurt, you'd feel misunderstood, it affects your confidence, you're mulling over it all afternoon. If you're in a more proactive state with time and practice, you actually start to ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Yes, there might be that moment of being hurt and reactive, but very quickly you start to say, what can I take from this? What's the message here? Or you might even ask for clarification from the person who's giving feedback. So it's just looking at where our power is, and our power is always in our responses and our reactions. And the more we can do this, the easier it gets. On the same point about becoming more proactive, one thing that helps me personally become more proactive, and I've really realized I've grown in this area, is realizing that I don't need to take things personally. Like people's behavior is often a reflection of their own internal world. There's that saying that hurt people hurt people. People that judge are often judging themselves. When you're more proactive and you realize that it's not really about you, then you stop engaging in unnecessary conflict because you understand that not everything actually requires a reaction. And that again goes back to that previous point on energy. You just realize where your energy is useful versus where it's not useful. Okay, next point. I think we're at number 4. You know you have grown when you change your relationship with control. This has been my learnings, particularly in the last few years. I really want to put this one in here because I was thinking about like growth, evolution, thinking about it in terms of my clients and when they start versus when they've been retraining the brain, working with their nervous system. A lot of them will often say, I don't feel so uptight. I feel like I can just let go so much more easily. And this is not only really beneficial for our health because we're putting our nervous system more into a parasympathetic rested state. It's just, again, comes back to that energy management thing. We don't put our mental energy into things that are outside of our control. There are many things we have to navigate in life. And our natural instinct is to avoid discomfort and cling on to control. The more things we navigate, often as a response, a natural response, the more we want to cling on to control because we know the feelings and emotions that come with navigating challenges and discomfort. But when we can really consistently remind ourselves of what is within our control versus what is not within our control, and we do this time and time again, it is such a powerful way that we can evolve and grow. Because if we shift our relationship with having to tighten our grip on control and we start to realize that we're actually not in control of a lot other than how we react and we respond, then naturally some really positive things start to happen. Number one, I think you feel less fear around change. It comes back to making space for new things to come into your life. So an example of this might be like you used to struggle a lot with ending relationships or speaking up at work. Let's take the relationships example. Even when the relationship wasn't healthy, you used to struggle with ending this type of relationship. Now you recognize when you work on your relationship with control that letting go can create space for something better, and you trust that change just leads to growth and the next thing. So that is an example. If you are resonating with that, then you are growing. Another one would be like moving cities. Actually, I moved city last year? I'm losing track of time. I think it was the year before. It would be easy for me to come up with all the reasons not to move. But again, I think the more that you can trust yourself and just take that step and think about how things might go right rather than how they might go wrong, realize that that you're only in control of so much, and actually there's a lot of things that can come in along the way to change your path, then you start taking more opportunities. Another way to tell if you are shifting your relationship to control is that you start to feel less attached to outcomes. So you're focusing more on the process rather than the specific destination. Instead of obsessing about a goal, you're just going with the process, the learning, the growth, the experiences that can come with each step. And it's almost like a form of detachment that can keep you grounded and more adaptable when things don't go to plan as much. So if I go back to that relationship example, let's say a dating example, someone who has grown, let's say in the past, maybe that every date they go on, they'd be thinking, is this person the one? Is this person the one? They're really latched on to how it's going to go, the outcome of the experience. Whereas if you start to approach dating with curiosity and enjoying each connection without pressure, putting the pressure on for a specific outcome, it's going to be a lot more of an enjoyable experience. So it's just not gripping too tightly to the outcome. If you're doing that, that is a sign that you are growing. And finally, just to give some examples of how this might be playing out in your everyday life, this relationship with control and actually leaning into more trust and surrender. Let's say that your holiday plans don't go as expected. Maybe your flights get delayed or the weather isn't as good as you would have hoped. Instead of getting frustrated, you accept what is and you enjoy new ways, and you find new ways to enjoy the trip or to be present on the trip. It could be in a work situation, trying to micromanage every detail, every staff member. But now you've worked on this, you start to trust people or your team can do their job and you're more happy to delegate tasks. That can be another example. Or, I don't know, you're in a social setting and you don't know that many people, and usually you try really hard to make sure that you appear a certain way to people. You be really critical on how you're coming across. If you relax into the situation and you just start to let the conversations flow more naturally rather than really being focused on a specific outcome, that is another really clear example about how this would be showing up in everyday life. Number 5, signs of growth. You understand your patterns that keep you stuck and you see them as a form of protection rather than who you innately are. So this one I've talked on before. First of all, I'm saying you understand your patterns. So it's actually just recognizing we're all human. We all have our loops that we get into. We all have our habits and things that we're working on. And being really honest about that, I think, is a sign of growth in itself. Not trying to act perfect, to come across as perfect, to come across as having it together all the time. Unsustainable. I think when you just are real, then that is a sign of growth. But the second point of this is actually recognizing and knowing that this is just somewhere along the way been a protective part or a mechanism to protect you, and an adaptable thing that has helped you gain safety or validation or love, rather than who you are at your core. When we start to see these parts that we feel stuck with as simply that, a part that we can work with rather than who we are, it just means that we can practice more self-compassion and see things as being more changeable than rigid and purely our identity. Let's say you've grown in this area. In the past, you might have noticed a negative thought pattern or a behavior that keeps you stuck, something like procrastination or self-doubt or fear of failure. And maybe in the past, when it came up, you were really quick to judge yourself or feel frustrated for not being further along, beating yourself up and getting into that spiral. Whereas as you start to grow, you recognize the pattern isn't something necessarily to spend a lot of time criticizing or beating yourself up about. Instead, you start to have this greater understanding. You acknowledge that the pattern exists, but it doesn't define you. So you can have that internal dialogue of, I see this pattern, I understand why it's showing up. It's okay to have setbacks. It's part of the process. What do I need to do in this moment? I'm learning. This sort of self-talk is a lot more compassionate, and it's a lot more gentle, and it's a lot more productive than trying to shame yourself into change. Number 6, a sign of growth and evolution is embracing the beginner mindset. Actually knowing that the more you know, the less you know. I don't know if that's a quote. That's how it feels when I think about it. Like, the more you start to learn, the more perspectives you start to take on, the less you know, and it's being okay with that. So you become less rigid in your beliefs and open to new perspectives. You become more comfortable with not having all the answers. Instead of proving to people what you know, you stay curious. You're willing to explore, you're willing to question, you're willing to see different perspectives. I definitely think this is a sign of growth. And rather than criticizing someone to think a certain way, which I used to do a lot, you start to actually question, how has that person ended up thinking like that? Like, how had they got to that point that they think like that? And that is, again, a lot more productive than just completely writing that person off. I've had some really good conversations with close friends and people close to me where I can hold my opinion and really stand in my truth and my belief, but be so open and willing to hear someone else's views that are completely different than mine, and vice versa. And I actually had this moment with a friend the other day, and we had quite opposing views on something. And she asked me on my perspective, and I shared, and we went back and forth a bit. And we were just like, oh, we've grown in this area. Like, this is a sign of growth, being able to really respect each other's opinions on something, to be able to question, to be able to really throw around a few ideas. In the past, what I think I would have done is I would have heard someone say something and I would have thought I better agree with them, because if I don't agree with them, they might not like me. So yeah, it's just, I think that's something I've reflected on. You may or may not resonate, but just being able to stand in your truth and also honor someone else's opinion, start asking questions. I think that's a sign of growth, being able to live in the gray area or have your opinion, start to ask questions about someone else's, get curious, stay curious, and realize that we're always learning. We never need to have all the answers. And finally, number 7, lucky last, the 7th sign that you have grown is that you are working towards becoming interdependent. I have spoken on what this means before in another podcast, but I keep coming back to this concept. Interdependence is in the middle of being, one side there's codependence, which is being really swayed by other people's states and their opinions. Let's say your friend is sad, that means that you can't be happy. You'll naturally be sad with them. So codependence is being really impacted by other people's states. And then on the other extreme side of that, there's independent or hyper independence, where you can't rely on anyone. You find it really difficult to be vulnerable. You find it difficult to receive support. And somewhere in the middle is interdependence, which is what we're aiming for. So interdependence for me personally is where you are working towards really having compassion and empathy for other people, but knowing that ultimately you can't change their state. You can really work on your own. And by state, I mean like your emotions and your feeling. And you can show up on being the best version of yourself. So if someone is really down, you want to be able to relate to them and offer compassion and empathy, but you don't want to stay in that place. You want to be able to really center and ground your own state without being pulled into their stuff. So that's interdependence, when we have that sort of balance. And it's also not about being hyper independent either. So if you're an interdependent person, you can depend on others, but you can also depend on yourself. So there is a level of independence, but it's not to your detriment, where you can't ask for support, where you can't be vulnerable, where you can't express your emotions, where you feel like you have to do it all alone. I really see myself on both ends of the spectrum, depending on like what I've been navigating in life or who I'm around. But there is that healthy balance. And I do think that's a sign of growth. I think that's a sign of evolution when we are comfortable in our own skin and we also are really comfortable being connected to others and their emotions to a healthy level. Because let's face it, we are creatures of community. We need relationships. We cannot do this hyper independent thing that is promoted in the Western world, but we also don't want to be enmeshed too much with other people to the point that it brings us down, that we have no boundaries, and that it impacts how we feel about ourselves. So that is us for today, friends. I hope that you related. I'm sure you related to one or more of those points. I would love to hear what ones you related to. And I hope that you had some aha moments to really connect into where you have grown, where you have evolved, where things have changed. Because as I said at the start, sometimes we don't recognize it until we pause, until we think about our own life. It's like, I often use this example in my coaching. It's like when a Facebook memory pops up, we think that beliefs are hard to change, or we think, oh, I haven't changed that much. And then a Facebook memory pops up and it's like, oh my God, who was I? What was I doing? What was I wearing? What was I doing? What was I thinking? In those moments, we really recognize how much we've changed. And it's the same with internal growth. The more we can actually start to see, yep, things have shifted, and how they're actually, the internal shifts can reflect externally in the people that come into our lives, the opportunities in our life. It's just really reassuring. And I think it's a really nice thing to do. Okay, guys, I hope you have a beautiful week. Please follow, please share this episode or this podcast with anyone who you think will benefit. I love when you reach out, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or if you've got any recommendations of people you would love to see on this podcast. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode.